coming weeks. So like for what, Mark, the next 5 weeks, we have doctors that ALK Positive as a group have actually funded. Is that correct? For the next 5 weeks? Yeah. So
Yes.
it's so exciting that we get to talk to these researchers and really just learn about what's being done in the ALK space. So very, very exciting times for us. If you are not aware of ALK Positive Incorporated's mission, we were some members of the Facebook support group, and we kind of got together and we decided that we were afraid to wait for industry to create the next drug for us. And so we reached out to LUNGevity, and LUNGevity was able to give us a voice to be able, as patients, to actually pick research. So it's super excited. And Upal was in charge of that. He was the one who really helped us to create a rigorous process so that we can make sure that we're picking the most impactful research. So very, very exciting. We have all kinds of great things going on at ALK Positive. So please follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter. Facebook has a public page if you don't want to be a part of the Facebook support group. You can figure out what we're doing on the Facebook public page. And we also have a newsletter. So we hope that you'll join the newsletter. We have some awesome new swag, and all the proceeds from the swag. Erica Lavacek, who I think is on here, she has an amazing shop on the ALK Positive site. So I hope you'll check it out, because the proceeds go to research for ALK Positive Cancer. So I'll hand it over to, well, Mark, did you have some questions?
Yes,
Sorry,
I do.
Mark.
I'm gonna, we got, I believe, 4 questions that I'm gonna be asking people. So I'm gonna launch the poll. What medication are you currently taking? So if you can please indicate to us so we have an idea of where we're at. As the numbers come in, I actually have to read this or it won't show up on the recording. And that reminds me, we are recording this meeting, so just be aware of that. So I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results. So alectinib has 72%, which is a very high number. Second is lorlatinib, which is 13%. And then we have 7% being bernactinib. And then I'm going to launch another question. And this is the how long since your diagnosis?
I now can say more than 1 year.
All right, I'm going to be closing this shortly. So actually 1 to 3 years, it's at 35%, 1 and under at 34%, 3 to 5 is 18%, 5 to 8 years, it's 9%. And we actually have 3 members at 4% or 8 years or more. So you guys can see that. And I just want to let you know that basically what this is telling us is that the people that are on this call are fairly newly diagnosed. So there's a lot of information that we should be sharing with you. I'm going to go ahead and get our next question in. And this is, how many number of TKIs have you taken? And also if you have chemotherapy, you have to do a multiple choice on this one. So if you have chemo plus TKIs, you can put that in, or immunotherapy. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and I'll share the results with you guys. So 64% are on 1 TKI, which makes sense since you're newly diagnosed, and 2 TKIs at 21%. And we got chemo also at 24%. So I'm going to stop sharing that question. And our last question, you can see that, is, was there any risk factors prior to your, after your diagnosis? If you had any risk factors? So basically, this should be an easy one to answer, I'm assuming. Okay, I'm gonna end that poll and share that. So 86% of us had no risk factors before we were diagnosed with lung cancer. So Upal, you have an idea of who we are in the audience. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Colin. Colin, it's yours.
Thank you, Mark. So hi, everyone, and it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Upal Basu Roy here. I did not know Upal until I got involved with the medical committee in 2017. I think there were some other members that might have known him through Hope Summits and things like that, but I hadn't heard of the Hope Summit. I didn't know anything about it. But Upal literally, truly lives and breathes lung cancer. It's quite phenomenal. I think more than any of the oncologists just about it. It's really quite amazing. And he's extremely knowledgeable from a research point of view, but he's also extremely passionate from an advocacy point of view. And there's nobody that wants to see us living longer and better than Upal. So please, this is a casual conversation. He's got a little short series of slides, but we're not going to show them consecutively. We're just going to kind of show one slide. You can do your chat questions, and Gina and I and Mark will read out the questions to Upal, and you can call him Upal. Everyone calls Upal Upal. And just ask any questions that you want about any topics that are in the conversation. So we'll get the ball rolling.
Colin, thank you so much for such a warm introduction, and a big hug to all of you from New York City. And I wish we were sitting in a room and having this conversation, but given the nature of the pandemic, I'll take this as the next best option. And lovely to see lots of old friends, and looking forward to making new ones today. And the reason I bring up the fact that I live in New York City is Colin always gives me a hard time, because I'm sure you can make out from my accent that I'm not from the US. I'm from India. And combine my Indian accent with my speed of New York City, and that makes me a really, really fast talker. So all this is to say that if you don't understand me, please feel free to interrupt or shoot me a question, or just unmute yourself and tell me to stop, and we can talk more. And I actually wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I sort of came to advocacy, and then I'll tell you a little bit about LUNGevity Foundation. And then finally, we'll talk about the ALK Positive Partnership, the research grants that LUNGevity has had the privilege of partnering with the ALK Positives, and why that's so incredibly important, not just for the ALK Positive community, but I think for the lung cancer community in general. And I think that's just very, very important to keep in mind. Now, one of the now again, sort of who I am I trained as a cancer biologist. So I did my PhD in cancer research, and I also did a postdoctoral training in cancer research. And I also did a fellowship in public health. And this was actually very, very important for me, because I always felt that it's important to take what you learn from the lab to the community. Otherwise, we miss the mark. And my personal connection to lung cancer, I think, unfortunately, all of us on this call have a personal connection to lung cancer. And in 2005, I clearly remember this. My uncle was diagnosed with lung cancer. And at that time, in 2005, we just knew of two biomarkers, KRAS and EGFR. And we didn't have a drug for KRAS, and we didn't have a drug for EGFR at that point. And my uncle had just one option, which is chemotherapy. And he was a young man. And that was just the nature of lung cancer in 2005. And flash forward to 2015, my aunt got diagnosed with lung cancer, and again, young, and her cancer tested positive for the EGFR mutation. And I've seen firsthand what access to the right treatment at the right time makes for our patient community. And that's what drives me to support research. And that's what drives me to be an advocate. And what are some of the things that keep me up at night? And in fact, Mark, thank you so much for starting our conversation with sort of understanding what types of drugs a community has access to. And this is essentially what keeps me up at night. We need better first-line drugs, because let's face it, I'm greedy. That's my problem. I'm greedy. I want better drugs. we cannot stand still with the status quo. You know, whenever I think of research, and I think of, you know, where my uncle was, yes, we made a lot of progress, but is that enough? No, we shouldn't stop. We need to have better drugs. And I think the next thing is we need to have what's next. We need to have better what's next options as well, because we know that our community members, they'll go from one drug to another. And we need better what's next drugs. And in fact, looking at the poll, I saw that about 22% of our community represented today on this call, they've been on at least 2 TKIs. And that's going to become more and more the norm. You'd have 2, 3, 4 TKIs. And I want to see like as many TKIs or drugs as possible. That's what I wish for. And that's what keeps me up at night. And then the third thing that keeps me up at night is availability and accessibility of biomarker testing. And again, I'm assuming, and you know, we should have had a question about, you know, how many international community members we have here. I think speaking in the US, I think we have a different discussion about biomarker testing. And I know coming from India, that's really not the case. We know that biomarker testing is a luxury in a country like India. And I hope one day that it's not a luxury, but it's a right. And that's what I dream for. And the same thing about new drugs and new clinical trials. I think our patients live in this reality of balancing availability and accessibility. Again, looking at your poll, 72% of our community members on this call have had access to alectinib. And we know that that's not the case in the rest of the world. And I think as a lung cancer community, I think we can push the needle for better drugs, more clinical trials, more biomarker testing, and most importantly, making sure that our community members have access to these new research developments. Because in my opinion, we can do the fanciest of research, but if it doesn't get to the patient community, I think we have missed the boat. But all is not lost. And I think this is what is the best part of what I do. I think I tell everyone that, you know what, I have a job where I can be a nerd because science is what I live and breathe. I love science. But at the same time, I get to combine my passion for science to do something that really matters to me, and that's driving change. And I think you know the people on this slide. They're, in my mind, they're all change makers in the ALK space. And I have the privilege of working with all of these change makers. And I'll actually stop here and see if folks have any questions before I go on to my next slide.
There's a couple of questions here, but they're not really related to what you've spoken about at this stage. So we'll let you continue on, and we'll just, if people can try to put questions that are relative to or related to what Upal is speaking about at the time, that would be great. And I'll also ask people to only put in questions that that they want to ask. So if we kind of fill it up with chit chat, it makes it really hard for me and Gina to find the questions that we do want to ask. Thank you.
So Upal, would you just identify some of these change makers in the picture?
Absolutely. On the left, you have Vivek Tomar. He's from India, and he's like a brother to me. This is actually a picture that I'd taken when I visited him when I was in New Delhi 3 years ago. And he has a very, very special place in my heart. And on the right, you have our very own Bill Westlake. And to Bill's right, you have Dr. Drew Moganaki, who's a radiation oncologist. And I do see some questions related to treatment. Unfortunately, I'm not an MD and I'm not in a position to talk about any treatment-related questions. And I have been at LUNGevity Foundation for almost 6 years. In fact, I'll be having my 6-year anniversary in April of this year. And maybe, in fact, that's a great segue to the next slide, which is, who is LUNGevity Foundation? And we are a patient advocacy group. We are based in the United States, but we're expanding our footprint to the rest of the world because we realize that lung cancer is a global issue. And what do we do? Now, what I've sort of done here is essentially broken our programs into 2 broad buckets. And the lower bucket is improving how people live with lung cancer, and the upper bucket is improving outcomes. Now, the lower bucket that you see is our patient education, our support and survivorship programs, and Colin mentioned the Hope Summit. That's a part of our support and survivorship program. And these are our in-person summits. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we've unable to host any in-person events, but we hope that'll change really soon. And on the top, what you see is some of our big initiatives that have focused on improving outcomes. Now, on the left, you see advancing science, which is translational research, and we fund a lot of translational research, and and that's actually going to be the bulk of my talk, our translational science research program. And this is what I live, eat, and breathe every day.
Upal, could you explain for the audience what the difference is between translational research and clinical research and bench research is?
Absolutely. I think bench research is sometimes often known as preclinical research, and any research that happens before something goes to the clinic. And when I say something goes to the clinic, the first time a drug or a particular molecule or a particular test is tested within a clinical trial, everything before that is considered preclinical research. And sometimes it's also referred to as bench research. Now, clinical research is taking that bench research to the patient community. And the first step to taking it to the patient community is a clinical trial. So clinical trial is the first step of a clinical research. And that word translational research, which we hear a lot about, is essentially that bridge between bench research to clinical research, essentially making sure that some of those great ideas that originate in the bench, they end up in the clinical trial world. And also some of the data that we collect in a clinical trial setting. For example, we can collect tissue samples from our patient community, we can collect blood samples. Translational research also looks at examining some of these tissues, these specimens, for lack of better words, to make sure that the drug is working and it's doing what it's supposed to do.
So if they're testing alectinib before it was approved, and they're testing it in tissue samples and then testing it in mice, is that considered basic or translational?
I would say that that's considered both, because basic research is it's the mouse work that we are talking about, but there's a huge translation component to it. And that's why I say that it's the bridge, because translational research can have pieces of basic research and it can also have components of clinical research. So I think of it as sort of an umbrella term that sort of bridges these two broad groups.
Terrific. And before you move to the next slide, I'm sure the members here would love to know some of the patient education materials that you've got available and some of the projects that you've got that can help people find clinical trials and things like that. I think patients here would have a great interest in that.
Absolutely. So we have a very comprehensive slew of patient education materials, and we have something called Lung Cancer 101, which is our website. And if you go to our website, you'll see that everything is categorized by type of diagnosis, biomarker, and treatment options. And the website is always up to date, and the website is always reviewed by scientific experts. And if you actually go and look for the experts who review it, it's essentially the same experts serving our community. Now, in terms of clinical trial finding, we have something called a clinical trial finder. It's embedded in our website. It's a platform where you can enter information about your diagnosis. And what it does is it spits out the clinical trials that are suited to you and for your type of diagnosis. And in this case, ALK positive lung cancer. And speaking of clinical trials, I will spend a little bit of time on that middle pillar that you see, the improving access and changing practice. And this is, I'm going to channelize our CEO, Andrea Ferris. I'm going to channelize my inner Andrea right now, because she's a very, very high level strategic thinker. And she always challenges us as members of LUNGevity Foundation. When we think of a project, is it going to benefit our patient community? And she always challenges us to think of three questions. What is the problem we are trying to solve? Who are the people who need to be at the table? And how are we going to solve the problem? And what I've listed there, lung cancer screening, clinical trial transformation, and accelerating precision medicine, which is making sure patients have access to biomarker testing. They're incredibly complicated problems, and they do not involve one group of people. They involve the FDA, they involve doctors, they involve pharma companies. And we've been doing a lot of work in this area where we bring people together from all of these different stakeholders, from all of these different groups, to really problem solve and make sure that we can remove barriers to screening, barriers to precision medicine, and barriers to clinical trial. And lastly, I'll spend a little bit of time, and I do have a slide on patient force, which is generating data from our patient community. And when I say data, I mean real world data, because I think a lot of the data that we have from the lung cancer community, especially patient experience data, comes from the clinical trial realm. But we know that that's a great beginning, but every patient doesn't have access to clinical trials. And we also know that certain drugs act differently when it's out in the real world setting. And this is what Patient Force aims to do. understand the lived experience of lung cancer patients and the caregivers outside of a clinical trial setting. I'm actually going to stop here and see if people have any questions before I go on to talking about our partnership with the ALK Positive community.
Emily Venanzi, who you know extremely well, wants to know, when did you start working for LUNGevity?
I started in April of 2015. So as I said, I will be having my 6-year anniversary in exactly 2 months.
Wonderful.
I think there was a really good question. How did you get involved with ALK?
I think I got involved with ALK positive lung cancer, with the ALK positive community when Gina reached out to Andrea and said, let's think of having a partnership. And that's how I got involved with the ALK positive community. And what started off as just sort of a discussion has evolved into deep and long-lasting friendships. And that's what I think of advocacy. And I was telling this to Colin a couple of weeks ago that, you know what, we would all be friends irrespective of where we met. But, you know, lung cancer is that connection that brought us together, and that's become and blossomed into this deep friendship. And that for me is what advocacy is about. It's not just about driving change, but it's also about celebrating these friendships.
It wasn't actually me who reached out to Andrea, though. Just I don't want to take credit where it's not due, but it was definitely a team effort. Do you have anything else, Colin?
There's a question here. I'm trying to read it. I don't know whether. So I'll read it out, and if you certainly don't feel obliged to answer certain questions, but the question is, how do we best advocate for ourselves with Big Pharma to continue to fund research for better therapies where we will not develop resistance? Dr. Alice Shaw gave us the impression that pharma might think we have enough.
That's actually a very, very good question. And I'll speculate in this, and full disclosure, this is my personal opinion. I think what Dr. Shaw mentioned is partly true, but we also need to keep in mind and think of lorlatinib. When lorlatinib started, it started off as a 3rd generation ALK TKI, as a what's next kind of a molecule. But we know that lorlatinib is moving first line. So I think pharma is still very interested in the ALK positive lung cancer space. Pharma is still very interested in oncogene-driven lung cancer in general, because of the fact that a lot of the drugs which will start off as 2nd or 3rd line, keep in mind that these are really, really good and powerful drugs, and they'll eventually move up to the 1st line setting. So I think pharma's value proposition, for lack of better words, is that eventually if we continue to develop drugs, at some point we may be in the 1st line setting. And from a patient advocate, I don't think that's a bad idea, because you start as a 2nd or a 3rd drug, but if that drug is better and if it becomes the 1st drug of choice, why not?
Thank you. That's a great answer. There's another question, which I think is really very interesting question. How do you get interest / funding for ALK research when we represent such a small percentage of total lung cancers?
That's a fantastic question. And in my opinion, again, my opinion, ALK is not a small subset of lung cancer, because again, you know, when we're talking about numbers, and if you think of the entire ALK positive community in the world, it's a hefty number of patients. The other thing is, and this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, that we sort of silo, and we'll talk a little bit about this when I'm talking about the grants. We sort of think about all of these cancers as, you know, ALK and EGFR and ROS1. But the reality is a lot of these cancers share common biologies. They act very similar. They respond to certain treatments very similarly. And they also figure out how to outwit these drugs also very similarly. So all this is to say that, you know, research that's happening in the ALK space is bound to percolate down and impact other types of lung cancer. And I think that's the value proposition that needs to be made with funders, that yes, we may be starting a particular type of research within the ALK space, but in reality, it's going to impact overall lung cancer. And I think equally importantly, it's going to impact cancer research in general, because again, when I was doing my PhD, my research was in colon cancer, and EGFR mutations were discovered in colon as well as lung around the same time. And the first space where drugs for EGFR became available were in colon cancer, and some of that research percolated down to lung cancer. So we cannot underestimate the fact that research beginning in even a small, let's call it a small slice of the pie, even in this small slice of the pie is bound to impact lung cancer research and cancer research in general. And I think that's the key message that needs to be given to funders.
Excellent. Another question here, does LUNGevity receive any public funding? If yes, what is the percentage versus private funding?
LUNGevity is a public charity, which means that we get public funding. And when I say we get public funding, it's in the term of, it's in terms of donations that people make to the foundations, or even what, for example, what we're doing with the ALK positives, because all of you are public citizens, and whatever fundraising that you're doing, that's all public monies. And in terms of proportion of public versus private funding, it depends. And I would say it depends on the year and it depends on specific projects. But I think on an average, I would say it's safe to say that between about 30 to 40% sometimes ends up being public, and about 50 to 60% ends up being private funding. And when I say private funding, I think it's important to keep in mind that private funding is attached to specific types of projects. For example, in this case, our patient education programs or our survivorship summits. Those types of grants that we call private funding are associated with specific programs. And research funding essentially comes from the public.
And do you get any does LUNGevity get any funding from any government bodies at all?
Thus far, we have not received any funding from government bodies, but that's going to change hopefully in the near future.
Okay. There's a question here that says, could you give the website where to find the trials?
Absolutely. And I have made a note of that, and I can do that as soon as I'm actually done sharing slides, because I don't want to go back and forth. I will drop the link to both our patient education website as well as a clinical trial finder app into the chat.
Terrific. And Janet Freeman-Daly must be on the call here, and she's got a note here that also says you can search all clinical trials on the NIH website, clinicaltrials.gov. But the thing about the LUNGevity one and other services similar to that is that patients don't have to dig through it themselves. They just they get helped.
And I do need to point out that Lung Cancer Sister Organization, GoTo Foundation, LUNGevity, we all have clinical trial search engines, and all the search engines that we have, they actually use clinicaltrials.gov as sort of the back data source. But what we do is we curate it. Our platform essentially curates it and customizes it for the lung cancer community. And that's true for a lot of patient advocacy groups. All patient advocacy groups have a very similar model where they're able to sort of filter out clinical trials in a manner that's relevant to their patient community.
And Wendy has asked a question, is the Lung Cancer 101 site that you described accessed through the LUNGevity.org website, or is it a separate site?
It is accessed through the LUNGevity.org website. And if you actually click on one of the top bars, it's called for patients and caregivers. If you click on that, you should be able to see LUNGevity 101. And again, I'll drop that link.
Actually, Janet's actually put the link here already. Thank you, Janet.
Thanks, Janet.
You can unmute and say you're welcome. Is there any data available or compiled related to ALK positive patients and outcomes with TKIs similar to that of lung cancer patient stats or current outcomes? I'm not quite sure that I understand the question.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but all I'll say is that the outcomes for ALK positive patients on TKIs, if you look at just the ALK positive slice, for lack of better words, the outcomes of that group are far superior to sort of the aggregate general lung cancer statistics, for lack of better words. And we know that that's because of the fact that TKIs in general, when a patient has access to TKIs, which is matched to their type of mutation, they tend to do much better than sort of that aggregate group of patients.
Here's a wonderful question. I love this question, and I'm going to let you kind of go on a little bit after you've given the quick answer, give a longer answer of why this is going to be so relevant and important in the future. And the question is very short and simple. Is ALK found in other kinds of cancer?
Yes, ALK is found. In fact, the ALK gene or changes in the ALK gene were actually discovered in the anaplastic lymphoma, ALCL. That's right. It's a mouthful, anaplastic large cell lymphoma. And that's where actually the name comes, anaplastic lymphoma kinase, ALK. And yes, it is actually found in other tumors, and ALCL is actually a childhood cancer. And when I say it's a childhood cancer, it typically affects children. And it's interesting because it reminds us as a community that we need to be doing much more research, because you would think that ALK in lung cancer and ALK in ALCL would behave the same, but in fact they do not. And we know that some of the tyrosine kinase, some of the drugs that work in lung cancer, they actually do not work in ALCL. And that just sort of reinforces the fact that just because the same type of alteration is shared by different types of cancers, their behavior might be different. And along the same lines, just because you have different oncogenes, sometimes they may actually behave in the same fashion.
So kind of related to that, at the moment, if you get diagnosed with lung cancer, the standard of care, which doesn't always happen, but the standard of care is to get biomarker testing. Is that happening with other cancers? And I ask that in respect of, say, for instance, you had colon cancer. Are they doing biomarker testing routinely? Because if they're not, how are they going to find that if it's ALK-driven?
That's actually a very, very good question, Colin. Now, if you ask me as a patient advocate, I feel that most advanced cancers should undergo biomarker testing. Now, unfortunately, what decides whether a type of cancer, an advanced cancer, let's say colon or breast, undergoes biomarker testing is the number of FDA-approved therapies available for that type of cancer. Now, in colon cancer, we have very few targeted therapies. And based on that, routinely, now, if you're going to a big institution, you will probably have a comprehensive biomarker panel done. But that is not the norm if you're getting treated in the community setting. And the reason for that is, at this point of time, as we are having this discussion, lung cancer has one of the largest number of precision medicine therapies that's associated with it. So biomarker testing has become much more the norm. But that's not really the case with, say, colon cancer or breast cancer or even pancreatic cancer. And I feel that that's actually very detrimental to research. Not doing this kind of comprehensive biomarker testing is, going back to your point, first, there is a missed opportunity to understand how frequent some of these different biomarkers are in other cancers. But equally important, we miss the opportunity of finding biomarkers that may have a clinical trial for a particular patient. And I think this is what people forget, that biomarker testing is not just to match people to FDA-approved drugs, but also to help patients find a clinical trial. And the clinical trial is the research side, right? So we miss the mark when we don't do comprehensive biomarker testing. Unfortunately, it's not the norm in other cancers.
All right, I think we're caught up on the questions, so I'll let you continue on there, Upal.
Okay, all right. And this actually is a great segue, now that you know about our translational science program and what we as a foundation stand for. This actually brings me to sort of our research program, which is a very specific piece of our foundation. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of historical context on where we started and where we are right now. So LUNGevity Foundation was founded in 2002 by 7 survivors, and it merged with another foundation called Protect Your Lungs, which was actually founded by Andrea Ferris, who is the current CEO of LUNGevity. And Andrea lost her mother to lung cancer. And that's what essentially brought Andrea to advocacy. And we've sort of, after that merger in 2010, we've sequentially added different types of grants to our program. We added a grant on, and by the way, RFA stands for Request for Application. So that's a formal call to the researchers to apply for a grant. So we started with early detection, and then we added therapeutics, a career development award, and then we did collaborative grants with the Stand Up to Cancer, ALA, with Stand Up to Cancer and ALA. So that was a dream team. And then in 2018, it was our first patient-partnered research grant with the ALK Positives. And thank you again for taking that leap of faith with us. And that's just been an incredible and very, very powerful journey. And we started with that grant, and then in 2020, and I'll talk about the 2020 partnership in a little bit more of detail. We added more, we had another partnership with the ALK Positives, and then we recently just announced grants with the EGFR Resistors, which is another oncogene-driven sister patient advocacy group. And in 2021, in addition to some of these other grants, we've also added some more grants, specific, the Health Equity and Inclusive Research Fellow and the Health Equity and Inclusive Research Junior Investigator. These are two grants that are really focused on increasing the representation of underrepresented minority populations in the lung cancer biomedical workforce, essentially making sure that doctors and researchers from minority communities have that opportunity to become lung cancer researchers, because we firmly believe that if we do not invest in researchers of today, we will not have enough lung cancer researchers 5-10 years down the line. And finally, we have another grant focused specifically on veterans administration, because we know that lung cancer is an unmet need in that community. So again, essentially focusing on research within the VA. And that then brings me to talking about our awesome partnership. And I've highlighted some key phrases here, which are incredibly important. And just the power of these words: first ever scientific research award funded by the ALK Positives, huge. And keep in mind, in
Mark, could you unmute everyone?
That is so huge.
That is incredibly huge. Being a pioneer in this space is incredibly huge, because you sort of pave the way for other groups forward. So again, it's not just impacting the ALK positive community, it's impacting all of us. And I think we need to keep that in mind.
Everyone is unmuted, so you can say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your support, for your passion, and for your advocacy. This is, in my opinion, advocacy is teamwork. Lung cancer is a complex problem, and we cannot solve it. One organization, one individual cannot solve lung cancer.
Yeah, I'm mute all, and then I'm going to unmute you, Upal.
All right. This then brings me to the 2020 grant. And again, big thing, and I've highlighted that key number there, 1 million. Again, a first. Keep that in mind. This is the first time an oncogene-driven group in lung cancer is funding research of this magnitude. Again, keep that in mind, being trendsetters. And this is really, really huge, which then brings me to how did we select the awardees? And I think this is very, very important to keep in mind, that you helped select the research projects. This was you guys doing it. Again, when I think of the role of LUNGevity Foundation, we were here just to support you, just to provide you with the information. And I say 2018, actually it's 2018 and 2020. The process was essentially the same, and I'll get into some numbers in the next slide. But this was the community selecting the grants. Keep that in mind. We as LUNGevity, we were there to support you. All of you selected the grants. And I think that's incredibly important, this participatory way of selecting research. This is patient-founded, patient-driven, and patient-focused, and more importantly, patient-funded research. And I think that patient voice is incredibly important for us to keep in mind. So how did we do this process? So for the 2020 applications, we had a very sequential, rigorous process. We sent out a request for applications in January 2020, and we have a two-step process. The first step is the letter of intent, or LOI, and we received letters of intent. We received 10 letters of intent in Feb 2020. These letters were evaluated by a panel of experts, and you'll see who this panel of experts are in the next slide. And they consisted of ALK members from you, and I'm seeing one of them right now, Colin, dear friend and colleague. And we had ALK scientific leaders. We had Dr. Camage, we had Dr. Christine Lovely, again, people you know. So this was a fantastic and incredibly powerful collaboration between the researchers and the patients. And for us, the LUNGevity staff members, we were just sitting and listening to these great discussions, and again, very powerful. after these LOIs were reviewed, we selected 7 of those LOIs. Actually, I should say you selected 7 of the 10 LOIs, and then they went forward. And these 7 LOIs, we asked these researchers to submit full applications. Now, what's the difference between an LOI and a full application? I call the LOI a teaser. It's the 5-minute elevator pitch. Now, if you cannot sell me on the LOI, then you haven't sold me at all. So the LOI is the 5-minute elevator pitch, and people heard it, and they selected 7. And then the full application is the direct presentation in front of investors. And that's the study section. I'm calling it, discussion in front of the investors, but we call it a study section. So we had the study section in July, and then we announced the winners in September. Now you may ask, why did we take time between July and then announce in September? The reason we took time is because we went back and forth between the researchers and the ALK positives and the scientists to make sure that the application that was funded was absolutely scientifically rigorous and meaningful. Keep in mind that sometimes there are questions that are not answered, and I'll give you that are not very clear in the full proposal. For example, statistics. I know when you think of statistics, you think of numbers, right? I think of numbers, and statistics plays a very, very important role in research, because statistics decides if a particular grant or a particular research project, does it have the right number of patients to be successful? And that's important, right? Because if you don't have the right number of patients in a clinical trial, you may have a great clinical trial, but if you don't have the right number of patients, then you can't test if the drug is working. For example, you can't have a clinical trial of 5 patients, right? You need more patients than that. And that's where statistics comes in. And this discussion between July and September, a lot of that back and forth was to make sure that the proposals are rigorous in terms of the statistics, in terms of the experiments that they proposed. Again, making sure that we fund the best research possible.
Before you move on to the next slide, can you just go back to that one? I know we've got a lot of members that are from overseas, and a lot of them wonder, are researchers from outside of the US able to be part of this process? And so if you go back to the very first part there that says request for applications, could you explain how that request for applications gets done and who it's open to?
Absolutely. That's a very, very good question, Colin. And in fact, I should have mentioned this, the request for applications where we ask the research community to submit their ideas, their 5-minute elevator pitch, for lack of better words. The request for applications was developed by members of the ALK positive community and the scientists right at that stage to make sure that the questions that are there in that request for applications is relevant to the ALK positive patient community. And I'll give you an example of that. The community was very clear that we would not be funding basic science, right? Because the goal of this research is not to fund super basic science. The goal of this research is to make sure we have that what's next for the community. So that should give you an idea of how the RFA was formed. Now, the second piece is, who were the applications open to? The applications were open to researchers all over the world. And again, we wanted to make sure that the best research anywhere in the world is funded.
And where do researchers actually find the request for applications? Is there a fixed place that all researchers know to go to?
Now, there are a couple of ways by which a researcher will, and let me put it this way. We at LUNGevity, we push out the RFA through a couple of different mechanisms. First is we issue a press release which has information on how to apply. That's one way of doing it. Then we email individual institutions to ensure that we have a database of individual institutions and we make sure that they get it, so they then send it out to their researchers. The third way we do it is we then send out invitations to individual ALK researchers. So we have a database of lung cancer researchers, experts in different types of lung cancer, and we send the RFA to specific ALK researchers all over the world. And the fourth way in which we push it out is, again, to send it out to other platforms. For example, IASLC, which is the International Association for the Study of Lung Cancer. We partner with some of these other organizations who then push it out on behalf of us. Again, our goal here is to make an RFA as visible as possible to the research community, and we do it through all of these different approaches.
And if there is a fantastic proposal from someone in Germany or Japan or China or wherever it may be, are they able to apply on their own, or do they have to partner with a US researcher? And if they do have to partner with a US researcher, why is that, and how do they do that?
That's a very, very good question, Colin. One of the reasons, so when we opened up the application to international researchers, we specified that they should have a partner within the US. And we got a very, very good application from a researcher in Sweden and Europe. And the reason why we said, let's make sure that we have a partner or the researcher, the international research as a partner in the US is because of the fact that, keep in mind, these are 2-year awards. And we wanted to make sure that as soon as the awards are given, researchers are able to start the research as quickly as possible. Now, if we had funded an international researcher who did not have a US partner, then activating that research award in an international setting or starting it takes a much longer time because of international restrictions and regulations. But having a US partner really simplifies that process. And that is the reason why we said that if you're an international researcher, identify a colleague within the US. The other thing that does is when you have that partnership, it also opens up access to more patients, access to more patient samples, and it fosters collaboration, which is sort of the indirect effect of ensuring that someone international and someone US partners.
Terrific. And then also you've mentioned that we have a panel of experts. How do you find those experts, and how much time do you spend working with them to get them to submit applications on time and submit progress reports on time? And tell us a little bit about your work doing that, because I'm just going to let everyone know Upal spends unbelievable amounts of time doing this. So I just wanted to speak very briefly to that.
I wouldn't say Upal, I would say us, because even members of the research review panel who are members of the ALK Positive group, all of us work really closely together, and all of us spend an enormous amount of time doing this. And I'll talk a little bit about the time in the next slide, Colin. But going back to your first question about how we identify the experts who review these grants, we actually have very stringent benchmarks to identify who review these grants. They have to have published in leading lung cancer journals about ALK positive lung cancer in the past 5 years. They would have had to lead clinical trials in ALK positive lung cancer within the past 5 years. And the clinical trials that they have led should have led to at least one drug approval in the ALK positive lung cancer space. And I think these stringent benchmarks are incredibly important because we want these leaders to be able to decide and vet what these applications. And the other piece is, if you're an expert, then you can also tell us that, has this research been done? Is pharma doing some of these research? Because keep in mind that all of these researchers work very closely with pharma as possible. And having these experts who've run clinical trials also makes sure that, and by the way, very often we will not know a lot of the pharma research that's happening right now, right? Because it's not been published or the trial data has not been disclosed. But a lot of these doctors have that knowledge. And having these really top-class researchers who meet these criteria also makes sure that first we fund the best science, but equally important, we do not duplicate science that is being funded by pharma. And the second group of experts we have here are biostatisticians. And I know they are really the unsung heroes in science, in my opinion, because they make sure that the studies we do, they are done well and rigorously. Because in my opinion, a badly done study which yields promising results is much more dangerous than a well-done study which yields negative results.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on. So this is just to give you a snapshot of the study section, and we did this over Zoom. And I'm sure you recognize all these faces. They're all absolute leaders and community members of the ALK Positive group. And this was a 3-hour-long discussion. I can tell you it was very intense and very, very enriching. And this is essentially that place where the group comes together, goes through the grants, discusses what's strong, what's weak, and most importantly, what's relevant to the ALK positive community. Because very often scientists may get very excited about a particular project. They're like, oh my God, this is fantastic, let's fund this. But in my opinion, if that particular project doesn't have any relevance to the patient community, then it's doing science for the sake of curiosity. Don't get me wrong, we need to be doing science for curiosity's sake. That's equally important. But at the same time, in this particular situation, we made sure that the projects that were selected were really, really those projects that were meaningful to the ALK positive community. And then moving on to the next slide, and Colin, this goes back to your question about time, and this is essentially the study section, and what you see below, that's me with my colleague Margie Jacobson. She runs the research program with me, and Margie and I work very, very closely with the experts, with the ALK positive team members. And I've just given you some of the statistics of what all of us go through, and keep in mind that all of these experts, the ALK positives, they volunteered their time to do this. That 1,000+ number of hours that we all spend doing this, the ALK positives and the researchers have volunteered their time, and we go through an incredible amount of information. And the research review panel has access to all of these documents, by the way, and they can attest to the fact that there's a lot of reading, a lot of discussion, and a lot of back and forth. And that's essentially a part of this RFP process, because we want to make sure we're doing the right thing and we do it the right way. And what comes out from this is essentially 3 fantastic projects. So, essentially your output is always proportional to your input. So if you have good input, you're going to have great output. And again, these 3 projects are very, very important. And again, the first one is Dr. Awad, and you know him. I think all of you know him because the ALK positives funded him in 2018. And this project is so important because it's the first vaccine trial in the ALK positive space. Keep in mind that this is the first one. And it's important for a couple of different reasons. First, we know that immunotherapy has not been very, and when I say immunotherapy, it's these PD-1, PD-L1 drugs. They've not been very successful in ALK positive lung cancer. So we need other approaches, obviously, outside of these drugs, right? And this is one of those approaches, using a vaccine. And the goal of this vaccine is to sort of turn ALK positive lung cancer, which is a cold tumor. And when I say a cold tumor, I mean a tumor that hides very well from the immune system. So the goal of this vaccine is to turn this cold tumor hot. And you'll be hearing from Dr. Awad and his project next week. So again, very, very important. It's the first in human clinical trial with this vaccine. The second project, overcoming bypass signaling in ALK positive lung cancer, and that's by Dr. Dagogo Jack, and she comes from Dr. Shaw's group in Mass General. Again, very important. Keep in mind that at this point, we know that ALK positive, that a lot of the drugs, a lot of the TKIs, they're very good at escaping ALK positive lung cancer. The cancer cells are very good at escaping the effects of these drugs. And what Dr. Dagogo Jack is doing is trying out different drug combinations to make sure that cancer cells are unable to escape the effects of these TKIs. And this project, again, is very critically important because some of these bypass signaling or some of these tricks that ALK positive lung cancer cells use, other oncogene-driven lung cancers also use very similar tricks. Keep that in mind. So what Dr. Dagogo Jack finds in her research, some of it will definitely be useful for some of the other oncogene-driven lung cancers. So again, not just ALK, broader. And lastly, Dr. Ifreti's project, again, very novel, which is using a very new type of drug to, again, make sure that cancer cells, the ALK-positive cancer cells, once they escape or once they outsmart the current drugs, there is something after that. And last but not least, I'm actually going to put in a plug for a LUNGevity project, which is very near and dear to my heart, which is Project Peer, which is essentially, when I talked about looking at real world patient experience, I did want to invite you guys to at least take a look at Project Peer. And if you're interested, participate in it, because we as a foundation, in collaboration with the FDA, we are very, very interested in those 3 broad questions, which is how do patients sort of go from one treatment to another? And that's sort of the reality of lung cancer patients, because we know that most patients will have more than one type of treatment. In fact, your survey, which you did at the beginning, attests to that. And then do patients on clinical trials do better? And then age of diagnosis. And I think this is a very important project, and this is open to all types of lung cancer, because we want to also compare across lung cancers, because we know that ALK positives, EGFRs, we have certain ideas and information about them, but we want to sort of see how they fit overall in the entire lung cancer spectrum. And a big, 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 big plug for our caregivers. They are the biggest unsung heroes in the lung cancer community, in the cancer community, in I think any disease spaces. I think we do not do a very good job of capturing the voices of our caregivers. And any caregiver, I would really, I would request that you take a look at the survey and participate, because we have a very specific section really sort of trying to understand what the caregiver experience is like. And I think, again, that's very important. And last but not least, I am just so incredibly privileged to be a part of this community, just so privileged. And this is like when I have bad days, I just have to look at this figure and this picture, and I feel happy. And this picture comes from a 2019 conference, which was held in January in San Diego. And that's the last time we were all able to meet together. And after that, we've just met on Zoom because of the pandemic. So when I see this picture, I'm just reminded of what a fantastic, powerful community I belong to, and we all belong to. And I think with that, I'll stop, and I'll actually also stop sharing my slides that we can actually see each other.
Don't forget, you can react with your reactions there. Just a good way to communicate with Upal altogether where it doesn't get so chaotic. I'm sorry, Colin, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. So if anyone's got questions that they want to ask Upal about the research process, advocacy, how to advocate, the programs that LUNGevity has, Upal will be more than happy to answer your questions or do his best.
I just had one comment for Upal. Dr. Awad is speaking next Sunday, so we should have a clear-cut vision of how things are going for him.
He is just wonderful and a passionate advocate of the lung cancer community. Just adore Mark.
I'll ask one question that I think would probably be on a lot of people's minds. Could you give everyone a brief summary of the projects that were funded in 2018? Could you briefly talk about those 3 projects, what they were on, and now they were 2-year projects? Obviously 2020 was kind of turned upside down with COVID, but if you'd like to explain whether they're all finished now, and if they are, what comes next with those 3 projects? If they're not finished, when will they be finished, and what do we expect? Do they publish papers? Do they, where does it go after that? So,
absolutely, Colin. Yes, they will publish papers. They'll present at conferences. That's sort of the first step from these types of projects, because we need to get that word out. We need to get that information out to the broader scientific community. Now, let's start with Dr. Awad's project. And that's a very special one, because the ALK positive community has sort of supported the entire journey of that project. So the 2018 project that Dr. Awad proposed, which was sort of looking at the same vaccine, the ALK positive community funded some of the initial studies, which made sure that the vaccine was able to come to the phase 1 clinical trial, which is again now what you're funding. So your support made it possible for Dr. Awad to bring it to clinical trial. That was Dr. Awad's project. Now, the second project comes from Dr. Justin Gaynor, and he's looking at a very, very important question, which is, why do ALK positive lung cancers escape the effects of currently approved immunotherapies? And when I'm saying currently approved immunotherapies, the Keytrudas and the Opdivos, they are the ones that are used right now, but we know that they're not working in ALK positive lung cancer. Dr. Gaynor's project is asking a very fundamental question: why do these drugs not work? And more importantly, how can we make them work? And if not, what else is out there? So Dr. Gaynor is expanding the repertoire of immunotherapy for ALK positive lung cancer. And his research is very, very nicely shown that when you think of a cancer, and it's not just ALK positive lung cancer, but in this case it is, the cancer cells have a very, very deep relationship with cells around them. They could be immune cells and something called a tumor microenvironment, which is sort of the neighborhood of the cancer cells. Dr. Gaynor's project very nicely shows that the tumor microenvironment of ALK-positive cancers are formed or shaped in such a way that they prevent the immune system from being attracted to the tumor. And he's actually figured out, using cutting edge technologies such as RNA sequencing, is looking at individual cells from ALK-positive tumors. He's actually figured out that there are certain proteins that are switched on, there are certain proteins that are switched off, which is what makes ALK-positive lung cancers cold, for lack of better words. And his research is going to give us a very fundamental understanding of how we can turn these tumors from cold to hot. Now, Dr. Awad's project is looking at one mechanism, which is vaccines. But keep in mind that that's just one mechanism. And Dr. Gaynor's research is sort of going to help us expand our repertoire of immunotherapy for ALK-positive lung cancer. Now, the third project, now Dr. Gaynor actually received a boost of funding from all of you, from the ALK-positive group, and his project is going to be wrapping up this April. And Dr. Awad's project is already finished, but as you know, his project is continuing to the next stage through the next round of funding. And the
Do you explain a little bit about why he was given a booster, and you know, was that meaning that there was something extra good about the project, or what was the reason that he got a booster?
One of the reasons. Now, this happened in 2019 when the research review panel, consisting of 5 members of the ALK Positive and all of you, you decided you wanted to give a slight bump to the current awards and the 2018 awards. And when I say bump, out of the 3 awards, give a little extra boost of money to that particular award, those awards that were doing exceptionally well. So what we did in 2019 is we asked the 3 awardees, Dr. Awad, Dr. Gaynor, and Dr. Nemenov, who I'll talk about in a bit, to submit a separate proposal which would build on that current grant that they were already working on. And Dr. Gaynor's proposal, this extra proposal, is the one that was selected by the research review panel as well as by scientists, because keep in mind, we always have both groups, our research review panel consisting of ALK-positive members and the scientists to tell us, is the science good? Is the science meaningful to patients? And Dr. Gaynor's project was selected to give this boost of funding, because what the committee members felt is he was sort of going to look at the single cell sequencing, which I just talked about. He was really going to drill down into individual cells of ALK-positive lung cancers to see how the cancer cells were talking to the tumor microenvironment, sort of that communication between the cancer cell and its neighborhood, sort of really going down at that single cell level to tease out what's going on and how can we fix it. And then last but not least, Dr. Nemenov's project is equally interesting and important. Now, Dr. Awad's and now when you think of the immune system, there are 2 branches of the immune system. One is sort of innate immunity, and that immunity is sort of the first type of immunity. So when, for example, think of, virus or a bacteria infecting us, the first immune cells or the first piece of immunity that gets activated is innate immunity. So think of it as immunity that's on in general. Now, there's another type of immunity called adaptive immunity, and I call it customized immunity, for lack of better words, and that takes some time to happen. Now, Dr. Awad and Dr. Gaynor's project is looking at that customized immunity, for lack of better words. Dr. Nemenov's project is, and keep adaptive and innate immunity do talk to each other, but we'll not get into that. Dr. Nemenov's project is looking at adaptive immunity, and he's looking at a specific molecule called complement. Complement is a part of this innate immunity system, and he's looking at drugs that block complement. Now, important thing to keep in mind that there are FDA-approved drugs which are used to inhibit complement. And what Dr. Nemenov is trying to do is to see if we can block the complement system. Can we reactivate or switch on the immune system such that, again, the ALK-positive cancers become visible to the immune system? And what's incredibly important to keep in mind about Dr. Nemenov's project is the fact that drugs blocking complement have been tested in clinical trials. So again, keep in mind that when there's a drug that's been tested in another type of cancer or in another disease space, we have an idea of some of the safety issues of that drug. We have I wouldn't say that it translates exactly into the ALK positive community, but we have a starting point. And then so taking something like that to the clinic is just much faster and easier. In fact, Dr. Neminoff right now is working with companies, and actually Colin had and I think you might have heard the conversation that Colin had with Dr. Neminoff, where he is in conversations with the company to actually test complement inhibitors.
Thank you. Excellent. So does anyone got any questions for Upal? Please
So
type
one
in.
on here, if he would just kind of talk about liquid biopsy versus tissue biopsy. And there was kind of an example that a tissue biopsy several times didn't show ALK, but then the liquid biopsy did. So I just wanted to see if maybe you could address that.
That's a very, very good question. And I'll sort of parse it out into two parts. One is a tissue biopsy at the time of diagnosis. When someone is first diagnosed with lung cancer, a piece of the cancer tissue is taken and the pathologist looks at it under the microscope and decides if it's non-small cell, small cell, adenocarcinoma. And typically what happens is a piece of that biopsy is should be used for testing. And that's the tissue test. Now, keep in mind that at the time of diagnosis, right now, we have to do that tissue biopsy to decide the histology, which is small cell and non-small cell. We do not have the technology to decide what type of lung cancer it is based on a liquid biopsy. So that biopsy has to be with tissue. Now, at the time of biopsy, and this is becoming quite common in a lot of medical centers, very often both blood as well as tissue will be sent for testing. And if results from blood come back faster than results of tissue, and blood shows actionable mutations, then very often, and when I say actionable, if there's an FDA-approved drug for that particular mutation or biomarker, then the oncologist may very often go ahead making treatment decisions with blood results because it's come faster, because the likelihood of the same mutation showing up in the tissue is quite high. In fact, there have been studies that have been done to show this matching between blood and tissue. Now, that's at the time of diagnosis. Now, if after that first treatment, the cancer spreads or the cancer comes back, it is recommended that you do a tissue biopsy, but very often at that point, blood seems to be quicker and it's also less stressful, right? Because thinking of having to go through another biopsy at the time of progression or at the time of recurrence is quite daunting. So very often an oncologist will get a blood test done, keeping in mind that you already know that a particular patient is ALK positive. That knowledge is already there, right? So the oncologist knows that this patient started off as ALK positive. So when he's doing that liquid biopsy, he or she has that knowledge. And at that point, if ALK is not picked up in the liquid, it might, and you do a tissue biopsy. At that point, if ALK is not picked up in the tissue, but ALK is picked up in the liquid, it may be that the piece of tumor that was sampled during that biopsy, that particular piece of tumor may have lost sensitivity to ALK. And that's very common at the time of resistance, because think of lung cancer as a mixture of different cells, especially at the time of progression or recurrence, when these cells learn how to outsmart these drugs, every cell probably may not be the same. So depending on which piece of the cancer comes out during the biopsy, you may see different things. And therefore, the liquid may see the ALK, because keep in mind that the entire cancer is shedding out those pieces of DNA into the blood. So the liquid may pick up ALK, but the solid tumor tissue test may not.
If you were a patient, do you think that you would try to get both a solid tissue and a liquid tissue biopsy?
Ideally, yes, because I think they yield very complementary information, right? Because the liquid biopsy can give you a quick result, and the tissue biopsy and give you a sense of heterogeneity, and the tissue biopsy gives you sometimes very complementary information. So ideally, I feel both should be done. But again, let's keep in mind that there are restrictions in terms of coverage and access. And I think that's the biggest roadblock here. So I think there's a difference between reality and ideal situation. Mm-hmm. And very often one is done before the other.
And again, speaking regards to liquid biopsies, there's several different liquid biopsy companies out there. does it matter which one you use? Are they all the same, or are there differences? If there's differences, which one should you use? Or would you recommend ideally, and again, I understand insurance won't necessarily cover even one, let alone more than one, but in an ideal world, would you get more than one if you could?
I actually am a little hesitant to answer that question for reasons that you just mentioned, Colin. First of all, I cannot. I have, from a science point of view, I have, an opinion about different types of liquid biopsies, but unfortunately I can't share that publicly. And in terms of getting multiple liquid biopsies, this is the way I sort of think of it: getting as much information as possible. And whichever liquid biopsy or test gives you as much information as possible, most accurate information. And keep in mind that when I say as much information, it's not the number of genes or the number of biomarkers, because sometimes think of it as an inch deep and a mile wide. And sometimes you can go a mile deep and an inch wide. So some tests will sort of go broad, superficially, and some tests will go really deep, but within a small fraction. And some tests do both. And ideally, I would go with the test that does both, but sometimes the choice has to be made based on insurance and availability.
Can you give me a tracking how you take an infancy of what we funded and how long it would take for maybe big pharma to be involved, or what's the next step of these, and what's the trajectory of how this works?
That completely depends on the type of project, Mark. And this is, again, pure speculation on my part. Now, Dr. Awad is working on a vaccine. Dr. Dagogo Jack is taking drugs that have already been created by pharma. Keep that in mind. So her project is not going to lead to the development of new drugs. Her project is going to lead to the use of already made drugs. So that's a different type of project. Now, Dr. Feti's project is looking at PROTACs, looking at a completely different type of drug. Now, other companies are looking at PROTACs. Now, when I say other companies or other pharmaceutical companies looking at PROTACs, they're not specifically looking at ALK, they're looking at other types of cancers, other molecules. So in that case, and I'm using only a hypothetical example here of Dr. Feti's, you have companies which have the platform, which is, the PROTACs, and then you have Dr. Feti, who's figured out how to use that platform for ALK. I think then there's a match made in heaven, right? So you have two sort of very parallel pieces of information and then coming together. I think it wouldn't take that long. And if you ask me to put a timeline, I think that's incredibly difficult, because part of it is also how research goes. But typically in such situations where Dr. Feti is taking a platform that's already developed and applying it to ALK, it can take between 3 to 5 years.
You're being recorded, by the way, so you better be right on target with that. No?
Upal, Colin and I have to jump off for our board meeting, but I was hoping that you'll end the meeting and just let everyone know what you see in the future for ALK and for LUNGevity and just partnerships.
I'll take the LUNGevity question first. I think, and not just LUNGevity, I think all of us patient advocacy groups go to Foundation, Lung Cancer Foundation of America, the Lung Cancer Research Foundation, LUNGevity. I think all the advocacy groups are at a sort of a critical mass right now. Lung cancer, if you talk to, say, the Andreas and the Bonnies, when they started advocacy 10 years ago, what the field looked like then and what the field looks like now is very different. We've come a long way now. Patients, patient advocates, they are sitting at the table having candid conversations with regulators, with pharma. And I see that becoming more and more deep, where partnerships between patient groups and other stakeholders, be it the FDA, be it other regulators, be it pharma, that's just going to become more and more strong, because I think people are realizing that everyone has a stake in this game. We have different stakes, but everyone has a stake in this game. And unless everyone is having or is sitting at the table, I think we will not actually make progress at the same speed. So I think that's one thing that I see for all of us patient advocacy groups, all of us becoming partners. partnership is going to become more and more key because, as I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, think about access to clinical trials or biomarker testing. Incredibly complicated issue. One group cannot fix it. And one stakeholder, let's say pharma, cannot fix it. So if we really have to fix these, we have to be sitting at the table working together. So partnerships is sort of going to become the new norm. It's not going to become rare. It's going to become sort of not the exception, but the rule moving forward. And in terms of research into ALK positive lung cancer, a couple of things that I do see happening. And again, this is my speculation. So full disclosure, I do see not just ALK positive lung cancer, but I do see sort of this happening for oncogene-driven lung cancers in general. I think a couple of areas or avenues that we will see happening a lot over the next couple of years is really sort of the role of immunotherapy in these oncogene-driven lung cancers. And when I say role of immunotherapy, sort of expanding beyond the PD-1s and the PD-L1s, because we know that those don't work. And I think that the field will not be spending too much time on that space anymore. We're going to be exploring new options. And the second piece that I really see in the ALK positive space is really figuring out mechanisms of resistance. And when I say mechanisms of resistance, I think really sort of figuring out two key pieces: what are sort of ALK dependent mechanisms and what are sort of ALK independent mechanisms. And especially in the case of ALK independent mechanisms, and what I mean by ALK independent mechanisms is cells using other molecules, not ALK, other molecules to outsmart our ALK drugs. As soon as we know that, we will proactively make sure that all of those other molecules are switched off up front. So we never come to that point. And I think that piece, the ALK independent pathways, I think is going to be revolutionary, because that's where that sharing with other oncogene-driven lung cancers come. Because a lot of these other molecules that I'm referring to, a lot of other oncogene-driven lung cancers do the same thing. And what happens in ALK is definitely not going to stay in ALK. It's going to ripple over.
Yeah.
So
We
Gina and Colin are going to hop off. Emily Venanzi has very kindly offered to take over for us here. So Mark, if you could open up.
Bye, Colin. Bye, Gina.
Yes. Emily, so you guys enjoy your meeting.
Thank you.
Emily is part of our medical board. So I don't know where Emily is. If you can unmute yourself, Emily.
I can definitely stay on.
I will unmute you for you.
Hi, Emily. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you, Upal.
So Emily, why don't you introduce yourself to our group here, just so everyone knows who you are.
So I'm Emily Venanzi, and I'm an ALK patient. I was diagnosed a little more than 3 years ago, and I have been on the research review panel with Colin and 3 other patients since the beginning of the review process in 2018, and have worked with Upal for a long time and really appreciate all his help.
We appreciate your service also. I don't know, do you want anyone have any other questions that they would like to, at this point, if you want to raise your hand with the reaction button, we will let you unmute and see. Upal, I don't want to, in New York, I don't know what time you stay up till, but if you want to hang out with us for a little bit, more than welcome
for a few minutes.
Absolutely. So on your reaction button, if you want to raise your hand, and then I will call you and you can unmute. You can actually ask a question if you're interested. And please, if you do have a question, make sure that it's not just a specific question. Oh, here we go. Adele, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I was the one that actually asked, what is her name? This is my first time, by the way. And my husband is the one that has the ALK gene, but I was the one that asked about the liquid biopsy versus tissue biopsy. And our experience was he had first and second generation tissue biopsies. And then we chose to go to, I live in Alaska, so it's early here. Anyway, so hi to New York. But anyway, I've done a ton of research, and I'm glad I did, because they did not even mention him getting a liquid biopsy. And he went through 6 months of chemo, carboplatin. Excuse me, I just lost my AirPod. Sorry. Sorry, I'm making this longer than it should be. But my concern is that why are doctors not giving liquid biopsies when they knew that it was non-small cell lung cancer, non-smoker? They didn't even suggest doing a liquid biopsy. I took my husband to California to another doctor, and they did the liquid biopsy and immediately found the ALK gene and was able to stop chemo. And chemo, of course, has already, laid its toll on him, and he has a lot of chemo effects because he went through 7 rounds plus immunotherapy. Anyway, I'm just frustrated. I'm frustrated that all doctors aren't like keeping up with this.
I believe, Paul, you mentioned that in your first slide, I believe.
Adele, first of all, I'm really sorry, and I share your frustration about this. And I think this is a very common, and sadly, this is a very common problem. And one of the reasons I feel, and I think, the lung cancer community feels that a lot of doctors do not use liquid biopsies is because there's an unawareness about it, first of all. And when I say unaware, I think a lot of doctors are not aware that, first of all, liquid biopsies are available, but they're also very accurate. I think, 3 years ago, liquid biopsies were at a very different point, but now we have much more sophisticated liquid biopsies. So a lot of doctors are unaware. And that sadly is the case. And I still remember this a couple of years ago, I was at a discussion, and a very famous speaker said, sadly, your zip code where you live also decides the kind of care you receive as much as your genetic code. And I think depending on where you get treated, it's not uncommon that if you're not at an academic cancer center, if you're not at a very big community cancer center which has lung cancer specialists, but you only have oncologists who treat all types of all types of cancers, the general oncologists, it is not unlikely that they would not know about liquid biopsies, because as I mentioned, and Colin had this question about using biomarker testing for other cancers, it boils down to partly that. Think of a general oncologist. It's very difficult for them to prescribe different tests. Your breast, you get this test, your lung, you get this test. For them to keep up with that level of knowledge is also difficult. So I think we as a community, we should be also doing a much better job in raising awareness amongst the oncology community.
Paul, there's been a lot of talk on our chat about insurances covering liquid biopsies. What is LUNGevity doing to help with that, helping the insurances pay for it?
I did not go into the policy arm of our foundation. We have a huge policy arm that actually encompasses all of those pillars that I was talking about. And one of the key pieces of policy is actually advocating for coverage of biomarker testing. And when we say coverage of biomarker testing, we consider both liquid as well as tissue biopsies. And we actually work very, very closely with CMS. In fact, in 2018, CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they issued something called a national coverage decision. Now, again, this is very US focused, national coverage decision, which was going to, which states that all Medicare patients will get covered by CMS. And that was actually very pivotal, and we work very closely with CMS, and not just we, I would say a lot of other patient advocacy groups. All of us work together to remind CMS that science had come to a point where this type of coverage was needed. And CMS actually issued the coverage decision, which was in favor of our patient community. And one of the things that we have been advocating for, and we have seen movement and we'll continue to see movement, is this piece about liquid and this thing about a lifetime limit. CMS sometimes will say that you can get only one big test during your lifetime, but we know that that's impossible for a lot of different types of cancers, especially for lung cancer. When you get a test at the time of diagnosis, then if the cancer comes back. So again, working with CMS and also with private insurers to ensure that liquid as well as tissue biopsies and multiple liquid and tissue biopsies are covered.
Gotcha. Does anyone else want to raise their hand and ask a question? I guess I'm going to have one more question, and then I'm going to let you go if you want to go. And that is, You mentioned at the very end, Gina asked you the future of ALK positive, and I think the answer that I can sum it up is ALK is not the only lung cancer is not the only thing that ALK is a driver for. So is the future, do you think that the oncogenes are going to get together, and when we fundraise and we put our lemon stands together, and do you think it's going to be a combination of a bunch of different types of cancers that will be funding research like this in the future?
I would see actually two different types of models and maybe a combination of both models happening, Mark. One is different lung cancer groups coming together, different oncogene groups coming together, because again, some of those shared issues, for lack of better words, because it just makes sense, right? To sort of pool your resources, much more amplification of efforts. That's one model that definitely will happen in the future. And also to your point about cancers that share the same mutation. And in fact, the ROS1ers have done a fantastic job. The ROS1ers are a patient group and a sister group to the ALK positives, but the ROS1ers are not focused on just lung cancer. They're open to all different types of ROS1 positive cancer. So again, their model was across all different cancers that share the ROS1 oncogene. So going back to your point, Mark, across cancers and across lung cancers, I think that's the future of collaboration and partnership that I see across patient advocacy groups. And I would say oncogene-driven lung cancers particularly.
One more question. The question is this. You've been in the space for, you said 7 years or 10 years? I don't remember.
I've been doing cancer research since 20 years at this point, and in advocacy specifically.
Well, I was diagnosed in 2013 and there was one drug, right? And the hope was very limited. So, I mean, don't you think the sky's the limit?
The sky is definitely the limit, Mark. And I still remember in 2004 when I was still a graduate student, and at that time, the first drug that targets EGFR, Iressa, came out. And at that point in 2004, there was a lot of excitement, but we didn't know that Iressa was actually going to target EGFR. So we had a drug, we had a biomarker, but we didn't match the two. So Iressa was actually taken off the market because when it came out, it was given to all lung cancer patients. And we knew that it was not going to work for everyone, but we did not know that. And that just tells me that we are at a nexus right now where the biology has kept pace with clinical development and clinical trials, which was not the case before. Sometimes the drug came before the biomarker, EGFR, right? And sometimes the biomarker came before the drug. Now things are going at a very parallel pace. We are at a very, very good point, and we are leveraging this right now. It's becoming more and more obvious when I see some of the newer drugs and how long it took for those drugs to come to market. Much shorter. As you said, the sky is definitely the limit.
Someone just said, what stage were you diagnosed? I was stage 4 and given about maybe 2 years to live. So, you know, now when you ask an oncologist, you know, what's my prognosis or what's my, you know, they don't give you an answer because there is no answer.
That's
essentially
the thing.
You know, and I think we have a lot of, as you can see from the polling, I mean, we have a lot of new patients who are just diagnosed on this call. And as a person who's lived with this cancer for 7 years, I can honestly say to you that lorlatinib, which I've been on for over 4 years, is a phenomenal drug. And if it's going to be a first-line treatment drug, you maybe never have any CNS issues, you know, which is really the game changers when you have the brain mets. So, and I know, you know, I'm not putting you on the spot, but we did put Shaw and Camage on the spot about would they use it as the first line. And Camage said no, he would leave it in his back pocket. And Shaw kind of hinted that she would probably do it. So, you know, it'd be interesting to see in the future what's going to happen. So,
as you said, the sky is definitely the limit. And I feel that we're sort of moving towards that one size doesn't fit all, even within ALK. You know, when you think of precision medicine, you know, we sort of say EGFR and ALK and ROS1, and we say that every EGFR patient should get the same first drug, every ALK patient should get the same first drug. But I think we are moving towards that direction where even within ALK, within EGFR, we are learning more about the biology of each of these types of cancers. And I see that slice becoming even more and more segmented. So, you know, for some patients, drug A may be the best. And for some patients, a combination of A and B may be the best. And that for me is where the field is going to go eventually.
Yeah, I just want to mention before you get off, we have 4 big doctors coming on board through up through April. Dr. Lin, Dr. Awad, Dr. Gaynor, and we're going to actually have Dr. Levy talking about the TPX 0131. Sounds like a bomb of some sort, but are you very familiar with that drug or no?
I'm actually familiar with that drug as well, and it's
Well,
it's awesome that you're going to be having all of these experts come and speak, because I think it's very important for the ALK positive community to know that they have the backing of these amazing, brilliant minds, and sort of get that first-hand perspective.
What's amazing to me is you guys actually spend the Sundays with us. You know, I mean, I appreciate it, and I thank you, and I'm sure everyone
My
on this call
pleasure,
thanks you.
and please
So,
take care, everyone, and enjoy your your Sunday. And for those of you in Europe and in other parts of, I would say, who've stayed on at night, good night. Have a very good night. And for Adele, who's in Alaska, have a wonderful evening.
you're
Thanks,
welcome, and thank
Upal.
you much. You guys
Take
can
care.
unmute
Thank
and say
you.
goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's Debbie. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Much for
Good
your
night.
time. Did they come
All
on?
right, everyone,
you.
good night. We'll see you next Sunday, same channel.
I don't know.
There was no picture.
I put, yeah, it's on.